Hello, welcome to the Witching Hour. I actually forgot what episode we were on, but this is going to be our hard polytheism episode. Like, I can't remember what number we're on, so I'm just going to say hard polytheism episode.
That's usually what we do, because I remember last time
I
was
put
the
my
heathen
name.
episode.
Yeah, yeah. We probably should redo the heathen one, and I was thinking of redoing like the Nawali one and stuff too, with Live and Google Hangouts, because the way that it focuses on us, like, and you can see our expressions and our hand movements, it makes the context of the podcast totally different.
Right.
You know. But he easily knows me as either Lilith or like Lilith Star or CB, short for Chaotic Blue, because those are usually the main screen names I use. And Keith, I can't even remember his screen name. He just goes by Keith.
Yeah, I don't really have any set screen name that people would know me by. I'm not really out there. Yeah. I'm just a random guy.
Just a random guy.
She found me off the street, actually. She was like, "Hey, I'm doing this podcast, and I'll give you $5." And I was like, "Sure."
But I want to make a huge disclaimer before we go on. Like I said, or I think I made it a little bit before, we're not bashing hard polytheists or belief of hard polytheism, but we are going to be really critical of it in this podcast. I don't have anything against hard polytheists per se, but I mean, I have a lot of problems. I have issues with it, but a lot of it has to do with people that I've, like, behaviors and attitudes I've seen from it. And it just doesn't make any sense to me anymore. And I think it's similar with you.
Yeah, it about sums it up. I used to be a hard polytheist, and then as time went on, the whole sort of hard polytheist outlook just made less and less sense to me, and I moved away from it.
For myself, when I was more of an eclectic pagan, I had some UPG that wasn't very hard polytheistic. But when I decided to do the Aztec Reconstruction thing, I tried to take up the hard polytheist outlook belief, and I always found problems among the community when I was talking to people. When I would say so-and-so God is probably the same as this God or whatever. And I got kind of fed up with it, but I kind of blew it off for a long time. And then later on, I realized I kind of really wasn't a hard polytheist at all. And I still consider myself a theist, even though I'm a monist. But I guess on the theistic side, I'd be more of like, I wouldn't say all gods are one god, like some soft polytheists. Those just more monotheistic. I would say more like, you know, you have a tree and like there's branches and leaves, and one branch might be one god, but it might have different aspects, you know, from different cultures and stuff like that. And for the record, I try to treat most gods, unless I really know conclusively or I know from my UPG, as separate entities, because I don't know. But one of the biggest problems I've had is talking to people about it, because a lot of the hard polytheists I've seen are very similar to the hard monotheists that I see.
Yeah.
You know, there's only one way the gods can be, and my way is the correct way.
Yeah, I know what you mean. For myself, I would say, like I said, I moved away from it, but I used to be a very typical sort of like Nordic reconstructionist, also true kind of heathen, and I always treated all the gods as if they were all individual, separate entities, even across pantheons. Like every god's its own individual and everything. But the more my own path sort of grew and developed and progressed, I started to come to the conclusion myself, and from my own experiences, that what you essentially have, in my opinion and my belief, is that you have, multiple gods, or holy powers, or whatever you want to call them, um, who may or may not be necessarily all one god, but more or less like you have multiple gods that have been worshipped in multiple pantheons under, different names and different cultures, such as Thor among the Nordic tribes, and Perun among the Slavs, and everything like
I'm
that.
sorry, you're gonna have to repeat because you were talking about you're gonna have because you cut out there. But you were talking about how, yeah, right before you said Nordic tribes, you were talking about how they're not monotheistic, but they're separate personalities. And then you cut out. So
basically, what I was saying was, I tend to view them as like all the different holy powers are essentially like one pantheon of gods, but who have manifested differently depending on the culture and everything.
and it's yeah, it's I like using Inanna as an example because she is the most radical version of a god going to different religions and different cultures through different ages.
Yeah.
She started out the Sumerian Inanna, then she became the Babylonian Ishtar, then she became the Greek Aphrodite, and if you want to keep taking things further, then she became like the Roman Isis, and it just kept going and going and going.
Yeah.
And she's probably one of the most confusing of them. I don't think all gods have like a bajillion aspects. I think some gods do and some gods don't. Some gods seem to be like they just have one aspect and they don't really care.
Yeah.
But and I never understood how I would get in arguments with somebody. Because it's actually based on historical data that pretty much Aphrodite is Ishtar.
Right.
Nobody really, when you're reading about the Near Eastern versions of Aphrodite, but I hear a lot from hard polytheists about how it's wrong. And I found that to be like very cognitive. Is that how you say it? Like it's wrong because it fit my belief. And somebody was talking, and the gods, and they asked about the Egyptian gods, and the answers I got from the kids very, very like what they wanted to believe, actually what the ancients believe, and that's what I got for hard polytheists. It's not the ancients believed, but they would like to believe.
Right. Yeah, I've also noticed that the hard polytheism that's espoused so much by many modern recons and everything is not really how it was viewed historically either. I mean, if you look at ancient polytheistic cultures and even modern polytheistic cultures such as in India and Japan, and you always see this idea that we see it especially among the Romans, where there's just like this one set of gods and everyone just worships them a bit differently, and you see ancient cultures would always they would always recognize other gods from other cultures as just their own gods under a different name, and they were more than willing to accept new cults and new gods into the pantheon and everything. And so the strict hard polytheism we see today, I really don't feel is that historical, and I feel that ancient polytheists were more along the lines of soft polytheists, but I feel like perhaps soft polytheist isn't the correct word for that, though.
I tend to agree. I remember somebody had brought up they took of ancient cultures will stick, and I said, there's plenty of ancient very hard polytheists. In one of the Babylonian ruler that it was almost monotheism
Right.
instead of God. And then you have Zoroastrianism, which is dualistic if you want to get technical, or monotheistic if you want to go the more modern route. And that's an ancient religion as well. So you have all these like variables, and I had mentioned it, and then I eventually said, I'm pretty sure the average Joe Smo of polytheism or of any theism in those ancient religions didn't really care about the divisions. Like they didn't think that, like the writers of the Bible who are henotheistic, where they'd only worship, where they believed in multiple gods. They were basically polytheists, but they were a subdivision of it. But they only believed one was worshipable, worthy of worship. Right. You would think like to me, I don't think they think, oh, well, I'm a henotheist, and they're polytheists.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. That modern, all the modern labels we have, like henotheist and hard polytheist and soft polytheist and monotheist and all these different labels. The average Joe Schmo, he was just like, they didn't get into that sort of detail. They didn't really care. It was just,
Exactly. And then you would have people like the writers of the Golden Ass who would talk about how he saw Isis, which was similar to how I saw Isis. Right. And she would give him a bunch of names like Juno and Hecate and a bunch of different goddess names that really weren't directly related to her. And it didn't seem like there was a lot of ancients that were like, oh, you're a liar. Oh, your UPG's wrong. This all seems like a modern thing.
Yeah, they didn't really care. It was just, it's like, oh, especially if they came across a new culture where like they worshipped a very similar god that had very similar attributes to their own, they'd likely just be like, oh, we worship that same god too, we call him this, or something along those lines.
Yeah, and then it gets like, you hear about, I had talked about Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca being twins, but they're not actually twins in the normal sense of the word in the Aztec pantheon, but they are definitely literal opposites. Well, my UPG told me that they used to be one god and they split into two, which is, there are two polar aspects of what used to be one god, and now they're completely different, like, gods.
That does have a historical basis too, as far as splitting gods go. I mean, it's the same. If you look at Nordic mythology, you have Freya and Frigg, who in later Scandinavian Viking Age, mythology were two completely separate goddesses. But if you look back earlier, you don't see this division between these two. If you look back earlier, you saw a single goddess who had attributes of both, and it very much seems that later on, around the time of the Viking Age, this single goddess split into Freya and Frigg.
Exactly. And then you have things like, if they can split, can't they merge together? So I've seen an example, one of the biggest examples is a god that's kind of forgotten, is Herm Anubis, which is the fusion of Anubis and Hermes. And that's exactly what the statues of Herm Anubis look like, literally a fusion of Anubis and Hermes. Sure. And I guess you could say the gods do like the fusion dance from Dragon Ball Z, or something. I don't really know, but I don't claim to know the gods, but I felt like a lot of the people that I had talked to that were very culturally purist and hard polytheistic felt like when I was talking to them, like they knew the gods, and it's like, I'm pretty agnostic about that. I don't claim to know, like, this is just my UPG. You don't have to believe it. This is what I go by. It works for me. If it doesn't work for you, whatever. And, I mean, if you think about people being so complex and culture being so complex, and you have somebody maybe like Lady Gaga who changes her style up all the time, I mean, why wouldn't gods be just as complex as human beings like that?
Right. That's true. Yeah.
And then you have things like, I remember when we were in philosophy class, they had mentioned that, do you think the same way you did a couple of years ago, or when you were a kid, or if you, because my teacher was old, she was older, and she's like, I'm older, and I can tell you that I do not think like I did when I was in my 20s, or my 30s.
So why should gods be any different,
Exactly. Why would gods, like, if they age, don't they change? And I think that's one of the things I didn't like about Reconstructionism, is that they don't accept that the gods changed. It's just,
yeah, exactly.
it's like one thing, and I'm like, no, not exactly. And I mean, to be a hard polytheist, you have to tell a lot of ancient religions that they're wrong. Like,
Yeah.
you have to tell the Japanese who took like a Hindu goddess or a Hindu god and made them into the Japanese pantheon that they're wrong for doing that.
Yeah.
It's like some kind of degree of cultural purity. I don't like that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And going back to what we said a bit earlier about how the gods can split and then merge and everything. There's within Shinto, which to those who might be watching this and don't know what Shinto is, it is the native indigenous polytheistic religion of Japan, which is still widely practiced to this day. Um, there is a process in Shinto called kanjo, which is literally when a kami or a god is divided, um, and then moved. So you do have this concept of gods being possible to divide a god into separate entities, um, of that of that nature. So it's definitely, it has historical, the idea of gods being able to divide and merge does have historical precedent.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Definitely. Shinto is really interesting. Whenever I think about, a lot of people ask, if an ancient polytheistic religion, if it had survived, what would it be like without Christianization and all that? I look at things like Shinto, and you can see them adapt new gods all the time.
Shinto and Hinduism are two really good examples. Yeah.
And there's some other good examples, but I don't really know a lot about the Korean religion that much, and I know a little bit about the Chinese religions. But I always look at Shinto as easier because the Chinese religions are like real complicated. Because there's so many people in China, and but you just got to look at cultures that have surviving like polytheistic beliefs, and you see that there is, like I said, with George Washington becoming part of the kami, there's no real cultural purity.
Yeah, I remember you brought that up too, that in Hawaii they built a Shinto shrine in Hawaii that actually enshrined George Washington as a deity.
Yeah,
which is really neat, isn't it?
I thought it was really, really neat.
Really neat.
I kind of want to visit. Like, I think I'd rather visit that than Washington, D.C. Like, look at this. They worship George Washington. It's awesome.
It's interesting, yeah.
I wonder what George Washington would think.
I don't know. I think he was always a deist, so I don't. I feel like he'd probably find it amusing.
But then also another problem with hard polytheism I found is, like we had talked about earlier with ancient religion. For example, with the Aztec pantheon for a long time, which is how most Aztec people I knew were hard polytheists. But when I started reading and researching more and more over the years, almost a decade, I started realizing they're more pantheistic, which still has like multiple deities, but is more like animism, like a bigger belief in a bigger all-encompassing belief. I'm not technically pantheistic per se. I do believe, that's why I say I'm honest, because I do believe that like all the gods and spirits and stuff and everything on the planet comes from one source, but I don't believe it's a god. So, and I believe everything's a part of it. That's why I don't call it pantheism when I talk about it. But pantheism is pretty close. I think it's the closest to my beliefs. I just don't use the label.
Right.
But and then there was I was watching a Wiccan lady. She was talking about how new gods and not just new gods like Lilith and Loki. I guess you would call them new gods because they're worshipped now.
Yeah, they're worshipped. Yeah.
Yeah, but she also mentioned gods that haven't been created yet that could be created in the future. And that was really interesting to me because a lot of hardened monotheists would probably disregard this for some reason. I'm not really sure. It's not.
I know what you mean. I was actually going to bring this up too, because this is something that I thought about too. And uh, many hard pilots would probably reject that idea, but I've always, since my own belief, since I'm more along the lines of a self-polytheist, there's nothing in my mind that a new god could emerge that could be essentially like the new manifestation of one of the higher powers and everything, but just a new manifestation to suit the modern day and a modern culture. Such as in what was it, Neil Gaiman's American Gods, where you had the gods adopt completely new names and images for themselves, with new gods emerging. I feel like that's pretty accurate in my own worldview.
Yeah, it's not just like old gods adapting the new, because I think there's a pretty good example of that. I remember there was a recent, I think you saw that article, where the guy was talking about Cernunnos and Wicca and Lucifer and Wicca, and how, he considered Cernunnos to have this aspect that was like Satan.
Right.
And if you think about Satan as kind of like an archetypical figure, the adversary, the rebel, it kind of made a lot of sense. And there's an Aztec god, Tezcatlipoca, who they did call Lucifer. They did call Satan. The Spaniards did when they came around. And they would call his brother Jesus, which is really kind of funny. But one of the things about Tezcatlipoca is he always seemed to revel in it from my UPG. And if you figure out that Satan means adversary, and you look at Tezcatlipoca's title, one of his titles in Aztec language is enemy. Well, so he's just basically taking something that was already pre-established. Like, he's not the literal Satan of the Bible, but he's just taking what was pre-established in those religions and using it for himself. And I don't think he's the only god that does that.
No, I agree with you there, yeah.
And then you have like the creation of new gods, and you have to think about that because the biggest thing I can think of from my research is Murdoch, because he kind of came out of nowhere and they have no idea where he came from. He was not in the Sumerian religion. He has no prototype there. They thought maybe he was a local cult, like a local god, because that was a thing among that hard polytheists usually forget is local gods.
That's true.
In fact, I never hear them talk about that. I only talk about the popular gods.
It's occasionally, occasionally I'll hear about some, especially like heathens or Nordic polytheists living in the Netherlands or Germany or somewhere, worshiping a local deity local to that area. Occasionally.
Yeah, I now that I think about it, I never really heard it when I was in Reconstruction. I wasn't hardly ever from anybody, unless they're very like culturally, specific. I guess people might take on a local god, but I'd noticed that was kind of missing from the narrative of hard polytheism now. And Murdoch didn't come from one of those cults, but usually that's how new gods come from. Is they'll start out as like a local cult, and they get so popular they'll put them in the mainstream pantheon. And I think they do that in Hinduism a lot, because Hinduism's really complicated.
Yeah, I know what you mean. There's one example would be Inari, in Shinto, Japanese Shinto, the Japanese fox god, who's probably the most popular god in Japan nowadays, but it's not actually mentioned in any of the old myths or lore. In the Nihon Shiki and everything, you do not find mention of Inari. And Inari came about, according to legend, was actually a local deity, a local agricultural deity that received worship in one particular area, and then the cult grew so large, this one day became more universal and became associated with agriculture in general, eventually, rather than just in that area, and became a very widely worshipped deity.
That's how pretty much I think most gods are. They start out as like local gods, and then they move on up to the mainstream. Yeah. And Inari is really a interesting kami, because depending on what region you're in Japan, they have different beliefs. Like sometimes Inari is a girl, sometimes Inari is a boy. It's all mixed up.
There's all
and
very enigmatic deity.
And that's probably my favorite kami, though. And not just because I play Persona 3 and 4 and all the Shin Megami Tensei games have that Inari as like their patron. Like
Right.
everything always happens at the Inari shrine. No other god has that kind of thing. But just because I really like that god for some reason. I've never done a ritual or anything. I just like that god. But it's interesting because Murdoch really actually did kind of come out of nowhere. There's really no evidence where he came from, but you have to think that he was a new god. So if you get down to the nitty gritty in polytheism, you have to think that every god was new at some time.
Yeah, and
I know
it's true. Yeah,
Inanna is now one of the oldest gods in the world, even if she survives under a new culture like Aphrodite or whatever. But originally, she was actually one of the newer gods.
it was always like, you know, the cult of a god always started out very small, and it was always, you know, something new. And I'm sure at that time people looked at them crazy worshiping this, or they might not have, but you know, it might have looked at them a bit weird. They're worshiping this new god that they've never heard of, that only like 2 people know about, and then the idea just slowly grows over time, and you know, they become very established and widespread. So every god was new at one point, and you know, was probably looked at a bit suspect, you know.
Yeah. And I think that goes with spirits and everything else too.
Yeah.
Like everything was new at some point. And so I mean these are the major reasons why I find hard polytheism really hard to, I don't know, swallow now. And I hadn't gone over it for a long time because I never really thought about it. I labeled myself as a hard polytheist for like the longest time.
Yeah.
But in reality I was more of a monist. And I kind of believe everything is connected, even if it's like indirect. It's kind of like life on the planet. All of the life on the planet, plants, animals, all that, insects, fish, we're all related in some manner. You know, we all come from one source, and that's pretty much how I see like the gods and all that stuff. But I also see that gods can change. I mean, if people can change and cultures can change over time, then gods can change.
And it's important to note too that in, at least in all of the polytheistic cultures I know of, the gods were always very human-like in certain respects. You know, they all had strengths and weaknesses. None of them were perfect or anything like that. And if we follow with that train of thought, then yeah, there's no reason that they shouldn't grow and change like we do.
Exactly. And like I said earlier about the age thing, you know, I mean, gods probably don't age like normal human beings because they're not human if you really want to get down to it. But you do have to calculate that over time you gain knowledge and your perspective changes with that knowledge.
Yeah.
And so how can a god not change? I totally believe gods can change. And sometimes it's for the better and sometimes it's for the worse, just like people.
Right.
And so I always found like hard monotheism is probably more problematic because it really doesn't make any sense.
I feel like it's very exclusive.
It's extremely exclusive.
And it
but
draws a lot of boundaries and barriers that really don't need to be there. And I don't want to sound harsh here, but to an extent, without trying to bash from hard polytheists, it does tend to breed more sort of extremism.
Yeah. I think both polytheism and monotheism, the hard versions, are too exclusive. Yeah. But they're not just exclusive. Like for me, the monotheistic version is too oversimplified.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have to be like, where did God come from? You know, why is he the only God in existence? What is he talking about in the Bible? You can use biblical evidence. With hard polytheism, it's a little less exclusive, but it's too complicated. If that makes it kind of like an Occam's razor thing. Like instead of going like the complex route, let's think of it like a more simplified version.
Yeah.
And stuff. But at least that's how I always felt about it. Like I don't want to bash anybody. Our next podcast is probably going to be more on Reconstructionism because we both. I noticed that this a trend among Reconstructionists over time, not just me and you. Somebody had mentioned with when you talk about Luciferianism and Satanism, a lot of people start on those paths, and then they don't stay on them. But they still have some of the aspects from that path, like they carry over to a different one. For example, one of my friends is a Luciferian, and now he's more of like a Shinto guy, but he still has aspects of the Luciferian part.
Yeah.
And I felt the same way about Reconstructionism. Like people start on that, and maybe hard polytheism too, and then they kind of move on later on.
I see that too. That's sort of what happened to me too. Like I don't really overly consider myself too much of a heathen anymore, since I would say that since I spent more time as a heathen than anything else, maybe 8 years or so, which, most of my, adult life, that sort of has really influenced me. It almost forms like the foundation or the base, and then I moved up from there, or moved on from there, and it just grew, developed on that foundation and that base.
Yeah, like there's still parts of the Aztec I can say that are probably not going to leave me, that still have to form a lot of the base, like for example the Nawali thing with your spirit animal or whatever. That's not going to leave me. Some of the shamanistic elements aren't going to leave me, because I noticed even though you can apply them to like the Nordic religion a lot and other religions, it's where I started out, so I use terms from there, though I actually kind of like the term fetch when you talk about that kind of thing. I need to do more studying in that area. But, I mean, every hard polytheist I've ever talked to, whenever I talk about the gods, I find it very difficult to talk to them about gods if the academia does not agree to their views.
I know what you mean. Most of them are very... There's always sort of... I don't know if it'd be a joke or what, but there's always this notion among non-recons and non-hard polytheists that hard polytheists and hard recons and all, study their religion more than actually practice it. They spend all this time in academia and reading, but they don't actually practice it, and they don't actually do it. To them, it's almost more of a hobby kind of thing.
And I find something wrong with that. I guess, because like with Satanism, okay, there's plenty of like secular religions. You got Satanism, you got Dudism, some forms of Wicca, that are atheistic or secular. But those people aren't really practicing as a hobby. They all have like their specific beliefs behind it. Even if they don't believe in the supernatural, it's not just a hobby for them. It's like a lifestyle. And it's weird to me that people would pick on the recon thing and make it into like a hobby. I mean, what are you getting out of it? I don't understand why. I mean, the ancients can only do so much. They had a very limited worldview and a very limited knowledge. They did not have the knowledge we have today about stuff. And like with the Aztec religion, one of the things that made me kind of like reading some of the atheistic biblical arguments that they would talk about how the Bible was outdated kind of made me rethink my recon stance a little bit, because you could apply the same outdated thing to the Aztec religion. Like they honestly believe that if they did not sacrifice people to the sun would stop moving and the world would end.
Right.
And no matter how recon you are, there's like no way you can justify that. It's not just unethical, it's an outdated belief.
And I know there's some recons out there who would try to justify it in some way, and they would try to explain it away in some way as to make it seem like it was just metaphor or something when it wasn't. And I feel like, because I remember when I first got involved in Reconstructionism and everything, the notion was to revive and reconstruct, but at the same time adapt it to the modern world. But I've seen so many recons and then hard polytheists and all who seem to forget the whole adapt to the modern world part. They just sort of forget about that part and just tend to revive and reconstruct as it was without really overly adapting it to the modern world.
That's a lot of my problems with I've seen with it. And then they get to being like, I think we should maybe do a podcast on this. Pagan fundamentalists, and I forgot to bring that up. They get to being like pagan fundamentalists. And I've seen that attitude more in Reconstructionism than I have in Wicca or eclectic paganism, non-traditional religions.
Right.
I've seen it a lot more in Reconstructionism, where they sit there and they just become like, and then hard polytheism is what they use against people.
Yeah.
All my gods are individuals. They all have individual personalities. They're just like this.
It's almost like, how like you might have fundamentalist Christians who would, point to the Bible, to specific areas of the Bible, and be really fun and have a very fundamentalist interpretation of it, and be like, this is what it says, this is how it is, and it's just, you have that same sort of mindset among many recons and hard polytheists who are like, this is how it was historically, this is how it is in the lore and historically and in academia, so that's how it is, and you do have that same fundamentalist mindset.
And it's very dogmatic.
Yeah.
And a lot of at least the neo-pagans, like the eclectic neo-pagans and Wiccans, they try to get away from the dogma, away from it. So you don't see that kind of like mentality there, but it's a very easy, especially since a lot of pagans have come from a hard monotheistic Christian background, usually Protestant, sometimes Catholic, where they were raised to believe in only the God, and they might believe in angels, but they don't pray to them like Catholics do. And there was like this cultural purity about it. You're a real Christian if you do X, Y, and Z. You have to believe certain things in order to be a real Christian, and here's the Bible and it says this. And I think those beliefs kind of carried over with hard polytheism and like stuff like that.
There's a lot I can say about sort of quote unquote Christian baggage being carried over into hard polytheism and Reconstructionism, especially within heathenry. I don't know if we want to cover that this episode or not, but there's just a whole host of problems with that I found in Reconstructionism. And I feel like that's where a lot of the problems come from, is that they have these very particular sort of fundamentalist, stereotypical American Christian Protestant worldviews and thoughts and ideas, and they carry them over with them, and that just, I feel like that's where a lot of the problem lies.
It is. And I mean, when you think about Reconstructionism and hard polytheism and how all your gods are individuals and all this stuff, you got to think, like, what time period are you talking about?
Yeah.
Because the gods were totally different in ancient Rome before the Republic than they were during the Republic, after the Republic, after the fall of Rome. Like, what are you talking about? How...
If we look at, like, if I go back to heathenry, if you look at in Nordic paganism, there's a markedly different character between, like, the Anglo-Saxon Woden and then the later sort of Viking Age Odin. There's a bit of a different character there, so there was a change there, and we see, especially with like the character of Loki suddenly emerging in around the Viking Age and not existing before then. And yeah, so it's like, where do you draw the line? Like, how far back I mean, if you want to go back far enough, I mean, with recons, it's, do you go back to like the Proto-Indo-Europeans and their ideas, or where do you draw that line?
Exactly. And I had seen one recon in my whole life, and I cannot find his website anymore, who worshiped the Greek and the Egyptian pantheon. And I'm sure a lot of people's brains exploded. And I think he was a hard polytheist in some manner. Like, I think he maintained that they were separate, all separate gods. Like, the Greek gods were separate from the Egyptian gods. But that's not how it was in ancient times. They merged a lot of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of syncretism.
Yeah, and you have to draw a line. Like, where do you draw the line on that kind of stuff? And to me, when I think about all the stuff, all the problems with hard polytheism and Reconstructionism, and where are you drawing the lines on getting your ancient support and all that stuff, it's kind of like the pagans. It reminds me of the fluffier pagans that used to claim that their religion was from prehistory.
Yeah, like yeah, I know.
You might as well be prehistoric. I mean, why not?
Well, it's like I brought this up with you not too long ago, where I got in an argument with a guy, kind of going with the whole hard polytheist, also recon kind of thing, who you had two heathens, and the one guy wanted to carry out a ceremony to the sun and moon, to the deities of the sun and moon, the Sunna and Sol and Mani, and the another heathen came in there and just started railing at this guy, saying, no, it's a terrible idea, don't do that. And his whole reasoning for it is because it wasn't historical, because there's no historical evidence that anyone actively worshipped the sun and moon deities in historical sort of heathenry, except for perhaps if you go back to the Bronze Age. But as far as the historical sources and the historical lore we have, there's no real mention of too much active worship. And this whole guy's whole argument revolved around that. And my argument to that guy was, so what? Why does it matter if they did it historically or not? It's something they, if someone brought up the idea back then, they would probably have no problem with it. So yeah, it's just it's one of my big problems with sort of the hard polytheistic, strict recon outlook.
Really strange. Like, I think you had told me you asked that guy why he was saying that. And he's just like, it's not ancient, and it's like, so if it's ancient, it's valid.
Yeah,
I mean,
where do we draw the line there? Do you want to give up? Do you want to give up modern healthcare and things?
And it's like the ancient Egyptians thought the brain was useless. Are you going to think the brain is useless now because they thought it? I mean, you have to you have to use some common sense. And I find that hard polytheism and somewhat of Reconstructionism doesn't always breed that kind of common sense. And the lines get blurry.
Yeah, it's often too fundamentalist, ultimately, I think. Oftentimes,
I like that quote from that Muslim where he was like, if you're just doing your traditions because they're ancient, then, that's what the ancients did, then it's proof that it's not proof that, the dead are living. It's proof that the living are dead. If you're going to follow your beliefs unquestionably like that, yeah. And I'm all for people using academic sources to base their beliefs on, but you still got to question stuff. Like, there's still there's a UPG element that's missing.
Yeah, I notice that a lot among hard polytheists and hard recons and all this. They have the academic sources and everything, which is great, but I always feel you need to balance that out. You have the academic source and everything, but then you also have UPG and everything, and you need to balance the two. And I see so many hard polytheists and hard recons just completely discredit and ignore the UPG, focus solely on the academic sources and everything, and every time UPG is even brought up, they ridicule it.
Yeah, and I don't like that. I never had that problem when I mean, like, they always ridicule neo-pagans for having UPG that isn't historical, but I have to say, at least I can say my UPG without people being judgmental of it. There's no freedom of expression when you just mock people's beliefs because it's not historical. I've got plenty of UPG that's not historical. I mean, what am I supposed to do? Like, recently, one of the most recent weird UPG stuff that I had. I don't know why I said RPG, but UPG thing I had, and it wasn't even.
Podcast, too.
Yeah, that's a different podcast. It wasn't even anything like I ever thought about praying to or worshiping or anything like that. Was my King Arthur dream where he was talking to me and I was praying to him.
I saw you posted that, and I thought it was neat because that's an example of potentially I could see people praying to King Arthur and everything, and you would have hard recons who would say no, he's not a god, you can't pray to King Arthur, but historically, if a historical polytheist would see no problem with that whatsoever.
Exactly. And I had to go to Wikipedia and read the brief history, maybe a bit biased, about the history of King Arthur. And there's really no evidence he existed. He's kind of like Jesus. You know, there's no real...
It's mostly a myth. Most of the King Arthur stuff's just...
But they think, like, they had some interesting theories. And one of the most interesting theories was he was originally a Celtic god. And he became like a folk hero, or like he may have originally been a Celtic hero, and he became like folklore, you know, into folk. What do you call that? Folk, not religion, but yeah, folklore. I don't know why I can't remember that. Well, folklore.
Yeah, I can see what you mean. Like originally a pagan Celtic god who perhaps after the Christianization of those lands sort of got demoted to the, you know, he was very popular. So instead of just disappearing outright or anything, he simply got demoted to the status of like a legendary hero.
Yeah. And interestingly, they didn't really blame Christianity on that. They more, because, I mean, it's not very, it was Christianized later when the guy added the Holy Grail and all that crap to the King Arthur's myths. But like the earlier king in the middle periods of King Arthur and medieval period, they weren't like very Christianized, so they don't really blame Christianity. It's just kind of like it was a cultural memory that kind of stayed in people's heads, so then they attribute him to like driving the Anglo-Saxons out. You know,
would be surprising because, you know, you see the same thing with Breed, you know, who was originally, you know, a very, very prominent, very popular Gallic, you know, goddess in Ireland and Scotland, and then eventually became a saint because she was so popular. They couldn't, you know, like her worship wouldn't just disappear because she was so popular, and she ended up becoming a saint and more of a folkloric figure. So it's definitely possible. Yeah.
It's very interesting, and I think it's really interesting. In Mexico, they have the Saint Death, and they think she came from the Aztec goddess, you know, of the underworld, Mictlantecuhtli, I think is how you say her name. And but the thing about her is that, like we were talking earlier about new gods emerging, is that her worship only dates back to 1964. It's not that old at all, but they definitely think it has to do with an Aztec goddess. But I just like how gods disappear and then reappear. And maybe we'll do another cast on this, but I noticed certain gods among the ancients were really popular or really unpopular now, and then vice versa. For example, like Lucifer, not a very popular god. Now he's getting people worshiping him all the time. And then you have like Marduk, very popular Babylonian god, not worshipped at all. I don't think I know anybody who worships Marduk. Tezcatlipoca was actually the most popular Aztec god among the Aztecs. But when I say Aztec, people think of his brother Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. They don't think Tezcatlipoca anymore. So it's really interesting to me how like the gods' worships changed. Like minor gods are gods that weren't thought of as much, like are all popular now.
We see that too historically, even. I mean, we see among the Indo-Europeans. I remember, you know, in the original Proto-Indo-European pantheon, the main big god was, you know, Deus, you know, the Sky Father. And the reflex among the Germanic and Nordic tribes would be the god Tyr. And there is evidence that Tyr was once the head of the pantheon, but over time he at one time was very, very heavily worshipped, but then his worship pretty much disappeared in exchange for Odin. Odin just came out of nowhere and replaced him as sort of the top god and the most popular, you know, one of the most popular gods. Meanwhile, this previously very popular god sort of just fell to the wayside.
Yeah, that happened, and that was happening in the Bible when they talk about Bel and El and all the little rivalries they had, where it's like some Canaanite tribes were worshiping Bel instead of El as the head god, and they were having all these like religious and political disputes, and that's where you get some of the stuff in the Bible. And also, I remember one Hindu god, Brahma, who is like a really well-known god, used to be worshipped all the time in ancient times, is not worshipped at all now. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever read that story. It was really funny. They actually have a modern myth for why he isn't worshipped anymore, because Shiva cursed him. Like Shiva was, I can't remember the exact thing Shiva told him, but Shiva was like, "You're not ever going to be worshipped anymore."
I
So,
can think of a few,
but
like, I can't think of their names off the top of my head, but I have heard of a few, like Hindu and Indian gods who were once widely worshipped, and then their popularity sort of waned and declined in exchange for other deities.
one of the most interesting gods, I think, is Kali Ma, because her worship is only 2,000 years old, so
Yeah,
she's
it's not
the age of
that.
Jesus,
Yeah, it's not. Yeah,
and
her cult isn't that old. I remember reading about that too.
yeah, and like she's considered an aspect of Parvati, who is an ancient goddess.
Yeah.
But it's just kind of weird that like she came, like that's what I was talking about. Like if you look at modern polytheists and you see the evolution of religion, you see different gods were worshipped at different times.
Yeah.
It shifts all the time. That seems to be a common theme, actually. That happened in Mesopotamia a lot, and the only god it didn't happen to was actually Ishtar, which is probably how she became so popular. She became Aphrodite because she was the god that's popular at all times. All the goddesses waned and waxed. Like might be popular for a little bit, and then a couple hundred years later, they're not as popular anymore.
Right.
It's really strange. It's kind of interesting. You have to think about that kind of pattern. And if you think about it, applying it to Reconstructionism is really, really strange.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm going to try to do a podcast at least once a month. We should have probably done one on Easter and dispel. Maybe we'll do that in a couple of weeks, about the time of Easter, because Easter's coming up in like 2 weeks.
I forgot
And
it was spring. I was like,
yeah.
Easter. That was, that was months ago. Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, outside it's already starting to look like spring out here. We got flowers and plants and everything. We probably should talk about Astara, the god that they said, or the goddess that they said is part of Easter.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't mind doing it because you know a lot more Anglo-Saxon stuff than I do. Like I know about Astara and I can quote academic on that, but I don't really actually know a lot of Anglo-Saxon stuff. I know more Nordic stuff than I do Anglo-Saxon.
Right.
And the Anglos and the Saxons, I know they didn't get along all the time.
Not really. There's a lot of. Well, you had the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Frisians, and you had basically different tribes, and yeah, they often warred with each other during the period called the Heptarchy, when there was like 7 different kingdoms. Some were Anglish, some were Saxon. Eventually, they did sort of culturally merge to form the Anglo-Saxons, or the English that we know today.
But then the Britons were separate from them because King Arthur was
Yeah.
listed as a Briton, and so is Boudica.
Yeah, the Britons were the Celts, essentially. They were the Romanized Celts that were there after the Romans left.
Okay. And then you had the Picts, who are part of the Celts from what I read, but we don't know that much about them.
Yeah, the Picts. This is the thing. The Picts were not sure of what exactly. The most widely held theory is that they were Celtic, but there's no real evidence to actually prove that they were actually Celtic. We just think they were. It's what makes the most sense, but we're not entirely sure. Some people have put forth the idea that they were the remnants of a pre-Celtic society in Britain, such as those who were responsible for Stonehenge and everything. But
see, when you start getting into Celtic stuff, I like Celtic stuff a lot, but like it gets real complicated because there's like 300 different tribes. And you can't remember everything, and some of them have like basically the same religion with a little bit differences. Like basically the British, the Irish, the Scottish are basically the same religions with slightly different, regional differences.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I do see a marked difference between like the Gaelic or Gaelic ideas found in like Ireland and Scotland compared to like the British and Gaulish ideas, where to me they almost feel of a different character. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's real convoluted because you got like mainland, which is mainland Europe,
Yeah.
and then you had the British Isles, and Ireland was pretty isolated for like a very long time. Even the Romans never made it there, so
they tried, they didn't make it.
I think that's kind of funny. I go by, for me, when I do Celtic stuff, I like Welsh and I like Irish stuff, so I usually go by that.
Right.
Maybe British stuff. And sometimes Gaelish. I mean, Cernunnos, he's pretty cool.
Right.
He's kind of a minor god, too. Speaking of which, when we were talking about...
Cernunnos is interesting because I have my own theories about Cernunnos that are a bit different than most neo-pagans. Like, I honestly think he was a more sort of character, more similar to like Pluto originally. More associated with like the underworld and like mineral wealth and agriculture and such things, and that his popularity seems to have declined around the same time as the Druids started to decline. And I'm wondering if there's a correlation between the two.
There could be. I don't know a lot about him. Like, it doesn't seem like there's a lot written. Like, there's not even a lot of archaeology on him.
There's nothing written about Cernunnos. There is actually a considerable amount of archaeological like imagery we found, like plaques and things about him, and we can use those to derive certain attributes. Like he did seem to be associated with commerce and wealth and agriculture. But the Romans, because there was a lot of sort of Roman imagery featuring Cernunnos, and the Romans often associated him with both Pluto and Mercury.
Mm-hmm.
A lot.
So he's going to be like, he's going to take some of the aspects of like being the god of wisdom and thieves and traveling.
Yeah, but also associated with the underworld and such things as that too.
All right, so I think this has gone on long enough. We'll do another podcast, probably an Easter one. Probably go ahead and do an Easter one. And then after that, we're probably going to do the Reconstruction one, which I'm going to add other guests. We're going to have Jacob, at least on one of them. And I think Ethan is going to be a regular like you and me are. And also my brother's supposed to move in sometime, so he'll start being a regular. He's a Christian, though. He just likes mysticism and stuff, so he's pretty cool now. He used to be bad, like a hard monotheist, and now he's kind of cool about stuff. So anyway,
on my rant on heathenry, then
anyway, thank you for watching. Bye.